through his name. Amen. Jesus and my job. There it is. All right. Yeah, we're going to talk about work today. I know that's an exciting topic, and you're all so ready to just dive right in and think with me about Jesus and the workplace. Now, before those who are retired and those who are not working for whatever reason, before you check out of this sermon, it's one of those where, oh, okay, I see where you're going, Gantt. I can sit here and more than normally, I can spend time playing on my phone or something. Before you do that, I'm convinced, as I look at this section of Scripture at the end of Colossians 3 and the first part of chapter 4, don't read it yet, but I'm convinced there's something here for everybody, from the stay-at-home mom to the person looking for a job to the teenager that maybe is looking for their first job. There's something here, and one of the big things, we are skipping ahead a bit, but I'll just tease you a bit as we continue to get this started. One of the big things in this section is the danger of people pleasing, of being one of those people that is a people pleaser. And I think all of us have a little of that person somewhere inside us. In Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 through verse 1 of chapter 4, the Apostle Paul, through his inspired pen or perhaps his inspired dictation, he writes about a very familiar group of people or groups. He writes about slaves and masters. And he spends a lot of time on the first one. In this larger section of Colossians, starting in verse 18, you have the principles that are laid down in the first 17 or so verses, now put into specific spots in life, from husbands to wives to parents to children, all the way down now for the ancient time. And there are still at least some places around the world where this is not necessarily no longer the case. And I know I just threw in a couple of double negatives there. But he talks to slaves and then masters. You get one verse for 5. Husbands, wives, fathers, children, masters. You get a few more verses to slaves. As to why that is, that's for another time or a different setting. But let's just say together this morning, or realize together, that Paul takes some time to reach out to those that may have made up a very large percentage of the first century church. Slaves. Now here's what we're going to do with that. And before we go any further, I am not, okay, N-O-T, capital, all of that, I am not saying that the employee-employer relationship or the manager and all of that, that any of that is a master-slave relationship. Okay, I'm not saying that. Now, you may be in a job where you feel like a slave to your job. We say that, don't we? You may feel like your boss thinks he's more than just a boss, or your supervisor, he's got the wrong word there. Instead of supervisor, he thinks he is the supervisor of a slave. He's the master or a slave driver. And we use those terms still in our culture, don't we? Slave driver, slave to my job, all of that. Now, that's not what I'm saying. But as we start applying this section, that is one way, with a bit of a cultural gap, as always. It's one way. That's what we're going to at least focus on this morning. It's one way of taking these truths and putting them in a what we call a modern context. As you think about work today from Colossians 3 and 4, here's one bottom line idea. Here's your takeaway statement, that Jesus changes the workplace. When I'm a Christian who wants to serve Jesus, it has to change how I do my job. It has to change how I do anything in this world. It is of a physical nature, or and of course mental as well. I think you know what I mean. When I'm working in some way, I'm involved in taking care in my part of God's good creation. A few passages just to throw out there, and then we'll look at our text. When you look at God's view of work, there's Genesis chapter 2, where before anything that we think of as bad and sinful in this world happens, Genesis 2:15, man is working according to God's design. Then you have the popular saying from 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 10, that if a man won't work, a person isn't willing to work, then you know the rest of it. Or Paul goes even further in Timothy, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. He takes it a bit more in a different direction, but you might say it's even stronger. I mean, 2 Thessalonians hurts your stomach, don't let him eat, but there's a more of a spiritual connotation, of course, to being an infidel who's denied the faith if you won't provide for your own. And then finally, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28, is directed to those who in their past life, before becoming Christians, had been thieves, or at least been involved in some type of what Paul calls stealing. And he says, let those that steal don't do that any longer, but let them work with their hands so they have something they can give to others. Jesus and my job. Let's ask 3 questions for the rest of this sermon this morning. The first question, who's watching? Who is watching? And then how, you can see that, right? Who, how, and why, or what, rather. I don't even know my own sermon. But how am I treating them? How am I doing that? And then that big question at the end, what's the reward in the end? Make sure we're in sync. We're not in sync. Okay. Now we are. All right. What is my reward? Here we go. First question, who's watching? I also attached the word ethic before that. You can think of the work ethic. Fairly several years ago, a few centuries ago, there developed from even some of these passages this morning the idea, sometimes called the Protestant work ethic, or we don't really like that word, so lately it's more Christian work ethic. Here's our ethic, and it can be made into the question, who's watching? Let's turn now and read Colossians chapter 3, beginning at verse 22. We're going to read 22 and 23 of this chapter together as we think about people pleasing. He writes, bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh. Already implying that there's a different type of master or Lord. But he says, obey them. But here he clarifies now, not with eye service, as men pleasers. We'd say today as people pleasers. But in sincerity of heart, fearing God. In verse 23, and whatever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord, and not to men. I know we've still got the rest of the sentence to go, but we're going to pause right there for a moment or two. He says, don't be someone, and to put it in our context for today, don't be someone in your job that you do what you do so that the boss or that supervisor or whoever it is that is to watch you, who's looking over your shoulder, don't do it for them. Don't do it for your identity so you can look like a certain person. Don't do whatever you do, in this case, let's say in your job, to please people. And that can be to garner their approval, or it can be to avoid their censure, their negative feedback on your sheet, or whatever it is. Don't be that way, he says. Have you ever seen that happen? Well, that's the question. It's all about who's watching, or who can see it. Within the construction community, whenever I give an example today, I hope you know this already, but I promise, I'm not trying to pick on anybody. I've done some of these things, so I'll be picking on myself, and maybe I am, I don't know. But in the construction world, I think about closets. And some of you might know, if you're smirking, you know where I'm going. It's kind of this running joke, let's say for a drywall crew, not to finish the closets in a house. You save time, and if you're not being paid by the hour, you want to speed the job up. Now, there's another problem, right? If you're working by the hour, now we got to drag this out. But they won't do the closets or carpet layers. And part of the reason I mentioned this one is when we moved to Elk City, our house, the master closet, there's no carpet because the carpet layers said, hey, nobody checks the closets. And so we had to have another crew come in and put down some carpet in the closet. People do that. What Paul's talking about here wasn't just an ancient slave master problem. People do it. It's all about who's watching and who's not. It's all about appearances. If I can clean the house in places where they normally would see the dust, I'm good to go. If I can build the building with cheaper materials on the interior and whatever people see on the exterior looks good, I'm good to go. But Paul says, no, it's not how it works. Now, when he says here, you do this to the Lord and not to men, that goes deeper. He could have just said, and there are passages, we mentioned some, he could have just said, remember you're working to provide for your family. Or remember you're working so you can have some things to share with other people and take care of people that perhaps are unable to work or those that are unfortunate for whatever reason. And all of that is true and factors into our vocational outlook. But he takes it a step higher here and he says, when you're working, let's say for so-and-so, Monday, Friday, whatever day it is, and whether you got that Monday through Friday, 40-hour week or 70 hours or whatever it is, you're not working for them. Not really. You're working, he says, for Jesus. So, people pleasing, who are you really trying to please? And when he says here, not as the men's service, as men pleasers, or eye service as men pleasers, but to the Lord, keep in mind, he's not saying don't try to keep things happy with your boss. Don't make it your job, like some people may think, to disorient your workplace and disturb your boss's life. Just know that primarily your focus isn't about making them happy. It's about pleasing Jesus. Now, when he says you're working for the Lord, that also means this for the Christian in the workplace. Even if it is something your boss asks you to do, it means you're not going to do something that violates Jesus' teachings. Whether that is stealing from your boss or doing something that might be illegal for your boss. And don't try to tell me that doesn't happen. It also means this. It also means that you don't go the other way. You see, this passage means I can't be a lazy worker as a Christian, but it also means I shouldn't be a workaholic either. Because that's just as wrong if I'm working for the Lord. I also include this word in my thoughts from this passage, the word integrity. Integrity. It's been said that our truest integrity, who we really are, our real deal character, is when we are all alone. Whether that is that we're all alone in our home, the private of our home, or maybe it is in a situation where we're working and we have some liberty and there's nobody around. That supervisor's not there. I might not even be on camera. And I can just do whatever I want to do. Right? Integrity. Here, Paul says, Work with sincerity of heart. Work with a devotion that is single-minded, where you're focused on getting your work done because you're ultimately working to glorify and serve Jesus. Integrity. It makes me think of the story of a retired man who became curious as a new building, commercial building, began to come up near his apartments. And so he began to go out every day, and he would stand and watch. And he was really intrigued by how careful and conscientious this one heavy machinery, this one operator was. And so he began to watch him every day. Finally, one day, as the man is about to leave work, he went up to him and says, "Sir, I just want you to know, I'm retired and all of that, but I've been watching you, and I'm amazed at your work ethic." And the operator says, "Wait, you're not the supervisor?" Who's watching? It all depends on who's watching. And then lastly, for this question, you could put it down this way, that Paul says, obey Jesus regardless, period. Doesn't matter. You could think of what Mary told them in John 2:5. Do you remember that? At the miracle of the wedding, or when it's about to happen, what does she say to the servants? You do whatever he tells you. You could take what she says there, out of context, yes, but you could take that phrase, and that solves a lot of problems in life and here in the workplace. Just do whatever Jesus would want you to do. Now, there are times when it is not clear. But when it is clear what the Bible says on something, what's the other saying? Just do the next right thing. There's a lot of truth to that one. A lot of biblical truth there. Obey Jesus. It doesn't matter who else is watching or who else cares. Ethic, who's watching. But then how am I treating them? I use the word equal here. Equal. As a summary term. Let's read the first verse now, skipping a bit, of Colossians chapter 4. Here you get the one verse to the masters for this task to, let's say, the entrepreneurs, the business owners, the managers, the shift manager, all of that. CEO, I don't know that we have any that would classify as that. We don't have a lot of those out in western Oklahoma, but you get the thought. Paul writes this, Masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. It might be easy for some company owners and business owners to look at their situation like this. It's my business. And I'm not here today to tell you you don't own the business. But the point is that you better be careful. Not so fast. To think, it's my business, I can do with it how I want. I can treat my employees how I want as long as the government, I don't do anything the government gets involved in. Maybe even then, if I can hide it, okay, and get by with it. I can run my business and operate things however I want. It's my business. It has nothing to do with my religion. That's what I do on Sunday, Monday through Friday, or Tuesday through Saturday, whatever it is. This is my business. And you can kind of make a double play there, right? This is none of anybody else's business. My business. Can you imagine a slave owner in the first century? Well, they pretty much legally could do whatever they wanted. Can you imagine them saying, no, this is my house? And Paul says, no. No. You treat them right. You treat them how they should be treated. You be kind. You be fair. Treat them in a way that is careful to remember that they're people too. Maybe that's why we have those jokes today about business owners and bosses being like slave drivers. Maybe sometimes it's easy for them to forget that they're not just employees. They're not just people to fill a time slot. They're not expendable in that way, or at least they shouldn't be. They're people too, aren't they? No, he says you treat them right. I don't know. It seems like there's a lot of employees that are bitter toward their boss or whoever it is in charge. And then I think that, and maybe it just keeps going back and forth. There's a lot of employers that are kind of bitter. I ran across this list of 9 different attitudes that bosses aren't too fond of. And you can look at this one both ways. There might be something here for both sides. And here they are. Have you seen these? Have you heard of these acronyms? The NMJ. What's that one? Not my job. Not my job. I don't know that I've heard some of these. The NMM. Need more money. The WCT. Waste company time. The PPP. Promises, promises, promises. Or then the NMH, some of these get, for me, are a little tongue twisty, but needs more help. So I just need more money to do this job better. I just need more help. And that sometimes, some of that, the help part, yeah, maybe that's true. Sometimes. ACD, not ACDC, okay? ACD, always complaining and disagreeable. Or the CWS people, the clock watchers syndrome. And then a couple of more, TTM, just the troublemaker. Some of y'all work with them. All right, the SRM, the 9th one, is the person who supports the rumor mill in the workplace. But in settings like that, the Apostle Paul writes by the inspiration of God's Spirit and says, you're equal. To the masters in the first century who owned their slaves, he says, when it comes to standing before the judge and the ruler, the master in heaven, you stand on equal terms. So take a lesson from Jesus. Learning from Jesus. Anyone who is in a position of authority can take a big lesson from the one with all authority and how Jesus leads, how Jesus oversees those, and that those are everyone under his care, under his watch. And for sure, as those in the church of Christ, in the church that belongs to Jesus, he is the head of the church, pertaining to all things to the body. Maybe I can take a lesson, whether I'm the head of a household in this context, or I'm the head of a company, or I'm an elder, or someone that leads in the church, whoever I am. Maybe I can take a step back and take a moment to learn some things about leadership, doing it gracefully and gently and rightly like Jesus. How am I treating them is the question for the employer this morning. The question for the employee is, who's watching? Last question. What's the reward? What's the reward? I used here the word eternal. Eternal. Is the reward for working you get to up the next guy as you pass him on the ladder of success and promotion? Is it, if you're maybe you are the entrepreneur, is it to beat the competition? Is that the goal? To check that next one off my list? Is it a paycheck every Friday or every 2 weeks? Is it a big pile of money to put away in a 401k and all those things and a CD and all of that? Or to have the job that allows you to live the life, the American dream, the American nightmare. Do you realize how many Americans go to work every day just to stay afloat? So they can keep having the nice house and the nice car, and to stay afloat, to have all of that, of their debt. Their mountain of debt. So we got to have a big pile of cash so we can keep paying off the bigger mountain hanging over our heads in our society. But that's not how Paul puts it. Let's go back one more time to Colossians chapter 3. Let's now finish that sentence that we interrupted earlier. Colossians 3, verse 23 through 25. And whatever you do, let's say in your job, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord. Keep in mind that if you're in this original context, it was very rare for a slave to even own anything, and it was even rarer for slaves to have any kind of inheritance when their master died. It happened, but rarely. So we almost have to flip that today. Paul's writing to people that were possibly discouraged about the fact, what am I going to have? We tend to go the other direction with that question, what am I going to have? It's how much can I get? What kind of retirement can I have? And live the life. So he says, you will receive from the Lord the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. But he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no, for the master, for the slave, for the employee, for the employer, for whoever you are, there is no partiality with God. What, though, is this reward? What's the inheritance? Well, you got to turn back to the first chapter and read 12 and 13, and you get a little more earlier. This isn't the first time Paul has used the word inheritance. 12 and 13 of Colossians chapter 1 is where he had or has written these words. It's a part of a picture of of the basic idea of being an active, vibrant child of God. Here's part of what that means. It means giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in the light. You get a little more there. Saints, light. That kind of already sounds like what we call heaven. But then he writes this, and this is more present. Verse 13. He has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of his dear Son, or of the Son of his love. These are the kinds of rewards that the Christian is looking for. And with the right mind, the right motivation, everything is different. It's like that other statement, whatever you're gonna do, if you're gonna dig ditches, make them the best ditches they are. It doesn't mean you have to stay in that job or whatever, but there is an idea that says, I'm after something, but it's not necessarily the big score. There's something more that I'm looking for. What am I after? We serve a God who spared not his own Son. As Paul asks elsewhere in Romans 8:32, how shall he not with Jesus give us all things freely? You see, the American dream pales in stark comparison to the Christian's dream of a throne where there are rivers of pleasure forevermore. Because, by the way, how long is retirement? How long is that going to last for you? How long is eternity with or without Jesus? What's the reward? Oh, well, let's be careful how we think about that word, reward. Here it is. Who's watching? Ethic. Who's looking? Integrity. Who am I looking to please? My job? My boss? Who is it? Then how am I treating them? If I'm in that other spot, and often there are multiple ways to look at that too, right? I might have somebody above me. I may not be the top spot. There's a very mutual aspect there. And then what is the reward I'm looking for at the end of the day? What's it about, really? Serving Jesus changes the workplace. It changes how I look at it, or at least it should change the workplace. And now we're at the point where we can just say, let's go to work. And I don't mean right now, but for those of us who are employed this week even, maybe this is just a good refresher. We relook at how we look at our work, how we look at those that we work with, and perhaps instead of it being just a job, maybe it's something more than just that. Maybe it's an opportunity to do something for Jesus. When I think about work, I think about Jesus and my job, I think about the blessing of being given a day not to serve people, but to serve the one who came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. If you need to become a Christian today, and you heard it, I see you reaching for your books, getting your stuff ready. If you need to become a child of God today, that's been beside our discussion today primarily. But if you need to put Jesus on in baptism, that doorway is always open here. And as Christians today, may we be people who are different, so that nobody has to ask you when you're at work, are you a Christian? They already know. Let's stand and sing together.